Hi, modern world history students. We're slowly coming to the end of unit number 6 on the First World War. Today we'll cover sections number 10 and 11. In section number 10, you're going to see why Germany was in position to win the war by the spring of 1918. In truth, the Allied powers were actually very, very close to defeat as a result of the Russian Revolution, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Battle of Caporetto, and Germany's spring offensive of 1918, also called the Kaiser's Battle. But as we pivot from section number 10 to section number 11, you'll see why it is that despite nearly losing the war in the spring of 1918, the Allied powers were able to turn it around and win the war by the fall of 1918. So let's get moving on that. So I'm starting you off at the bottom of page 16, and we need to remind you that as of the spring of 1917, the point at which the United States entered the war, Germany, as a matter of fact, was fighting on three different fronts. German forces were fighting the Russians. They were invading Russia on the Eastern Front. They were assisting their allies, Austria-Hungary, to fight the Italians on the Southern Front. And of course, they were engaged in this death struggle against the British, Belgians, and French, and soon the Americans on the Western Front. So Germany was fighting an incredible war. They were putting forth an incredible effort to fight a war on three fronts, and they were holding their own on all of them. And they were actually about to win the war on two of those three fronts. So let's take you to February 1917 in Russia. Remember that Russia was in pretty bad shape prior to the beginning of the year 1917. They had surprised the Germans at the very beginning of the war by attacking Germany before their army was fully mobilized. That was something that the German military planners, going all the way back to Alfred von Schlieffen, had not counted on. They caught the Germans by surprise, and that held out great prospects. There was great potential for the Russian offensive at the beginning of the war. But then at the Battle of Tannenberg, they had been catastrophically defeated by the Germans, and Russia had been invaded by the Germans and Austro-Hungarians, and they had been dealing with invasion for really 3 years, 2.5 years, by the spring of 1917. And in the spring of 1917, that is when the first of two Russian revolutions happened. Now, we'll go into detail on the Russian revolutions of 1917 in our next unit. I've found that it's too much to add all that into this unit. But suffice it to say that the Russian people were suffering already, even before World War I broke out. And then, during the war, as a result of the defeat of their armies, and as a result of the invasion of Russia, and as a result of the ongoing practice of drafting peasants into Russia's army, which of course left Russia with too few agricultural workers, leading to a collapse in food production and widespread starvation. The Russian people's suffering simply grew and grew as a result of the war and as a result of the German invasion. And if you remember, the British had tried to break through at Gallipoli to try to supply the Russians and help them fight the war, because the British and the other Western allies really wanted Russia to remain in the war so that Germany would have to continue to fight on the Eastern Front. But if you remember, that effort had failed. Churchill's attempt to break through at Gallipoli and supply the Russians had failed. So, in the spring of 1917, in February, actually late winter of 1917, as the Russian winter began to thaw, and it was really rather an early thaw in Russia that year. As Russia began to thaw out and people began to come out of their houses and interact outdoors again, they began to kind of compare notes with each other. Uh, Nearly every family had a son or a brother or a husband or a boyfriend who had been drafted into the army and who was either dead or a prisoner, or had been wounded, or was just suffering and was mentally exhausted from the war and demoralized. Almost all of them were faced with the prospect of not having enough food, had barely made it through the winter. And so discontent began to grow amongst the Russian people. And that discontent erupted into a massive public protest in Petrograd, Peter's city, which we call St. Petersburg. Um, and those protests were relatively peaceful protests, but the Russian people were protesting against the lack of food. They were protesting against the war. They were protesting against the leadership of the Tsar who had taken them into the war. And as with so many protests that had happened during the 19th century, the Tsar expected that this one would be crushed by the military. And so he ordered 200,000 soldiers into Petrograd, St. Petersburg, the capital, to try to suppress these protests. The only problem was it didn't go that way. Perhaps the Tsar didn't think about the fact that really all the Russian people were suffering because of the war, but the soldiers were suffering the most. And what happened is when he called these 200,000 soldiers into Petrograd to crush the protests against his government and against the war, instead, the soldiers joined the protests. They did not crush the protests, but rather joined the protests. And when his army turned against him, the Tsar realized his time was up and he abdicated. That means he quit. He stepped down from being Tsar. He gave up the throne. Well, what happened then was that a temporary government was set up to sort of manage Russia through the ongoing crisis. I mean, you got to remember, just because the Tsar had abdicated did not mean that the German invasion suddenly stopped. No, Russia needed a government to manage its war effort and to write a new constitution for Russia, or to write a constitution would be Russia's first true constitution. The problem is that this provisional government or temporary government made a fatal mistake. They probably should have started negotiating immediately with the Germans to try to achieve some sort of peace settlement and end the war. But instead, the provisional government, temporary government of Russia, which had taken over after the Tsar abdicated, decided to continue Russia's war effort. They decided to continue to fight the Germans rather than try to come up with some sort of peace settlement with them. That was pretty outrageous to the Russian people because, of course, they knew that the fundamental cause of their suffering was the war. And so the fact that the provisional government, the temporary government that had taken over after the Tsar abdicated, the fact that it did not take them out of the war opened the door then for a second Russian Revolution, which happened in October-November of 1917. The February-March Revolution had led to the Tsar stepping down. Now, in a second Russian Revolution, in October and November of 1917, in the fall, a group of people known as Bolsheviks, which are communists, led by this man, V.I. Lenin, overthrew Russia's temporary government, that provisional government that had taken over and had decided to keep Russia in the war, was then overthrown by a group of communists called Bolsheviks, who set up a dictatorship, a communist dictatorship under the leadership of V.I. Lenin. Lenin had then ordered immediate negotiations with the Germans to bring an end to the war on the Eastern Front. He had promised, as part of his appeal to the Russian people, he had promised peace. Now he needed to deliver it. The Germans, recognizing how desperate the Russians were for peace, demanded a lot. They demanded an enormous amount of territory be given up by the Russians in exchange for peace. Basically, all of this orange territory, all the way up to this line right here, to be given up to Germany and to Austria-Hungary. This included some of Russia's most valuable agricultural land, some of its most valuable mineral resources, and about 20% of the population of Russia. Nevertheless, the Bolsheviks needed to deliver peace. They had promised peace to the Russian people in order to gain support for their revolution. Now they needed to deliver, and so they agreed to this. This brought an end to the war on the Eastern Front. And that was great news for the Germans. Great news not only because they took over all of this territory, this valuable territory, but more importantly, it meant that they could begin shifting soldiers from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, from here to here, and dump them into the trenches in northern France in an effort to defeat the British, French, and Belgians before the Americans could really arrive and begin to make a difference in the war. At the same time, at basically the same time, um, Germany had more good news, this time on the southern front. So you remember, and if you didn't notice, I'm moving you now to the top of page 17. If you remember, Austria Hungary had been performing very, very badly, first against Serbia and then against Italy. And it was not until Germany joined the war on the southern front, where they did not expect to have to be fighting, but it was not until Germany joined the war on the southern front that Austria Hungary was able to put away Serbia and force them to surrender. And then they were able, jointly, Germany and Austria Hungary, to turn their attention against the Italians. And in the autumn of 1917, right around the same time that the Second Russian Revolution was happening, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians scored a decisive victory over the Italian army at the Battle of Caporetto. And the Italian army was driven backward and utterly demoralized. For all practical purposes, that brought an end to the war on the southern front. And although the Italians would fight it out playing defense for another year, the Battle of Caporetto crippled the Italian army and basically eliminated the possibility of the Italian army going back on the offensive. They were going to be stuck playing defense for the rest of the war. And that meant that Austria Hungary could continue to carry out the war effort sort of on their own. They didn't need any additional German assistance, which meant that all of the resources which Germany had been pouring into fighting the war on the southern front, and all of the soldiers that Germany had been pouring into the war to fight on the southern front, could now also be shifted over to the western front. So, for the first time in the war, Germany was not fighting on the Eastern Front because of the surrender of Bolshevik Russia and the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Germany was no longer diverting resources and soldiers to fight on the Southern Front because of the victories over Serbia and now Italy as well. This means, for the first time in the war, Germany would truly be able to concentrate all of their efforts on the Western Front. They could dump everything they had into the trenches on the Western Front to try to defeat the British, French, and Belgians, drive them backward, and capture Paris, and end the war before the entry of the United States could matter. Remember, the United States had declared war in the spring of 1917, but the Germans had been correct. The United States, with only the 18th largest army in the world at that time, had to recruit an army, train an army, and deploy that army to France. And that would take the United States over a year. And so, what the Germans hoped for then, with victories on the Eastern Front and the Southern Front, was now to be able to launch a massive offensive, a massive attack on the Western Front to try to bring the war to an end before the Americans could begin arriving in sufficient numbers to make a difference in the war. And so, in the spring of 1918, having shifted their resources and their soldiers from the east and the south to the Western Front, the Germans launched this massive offensive. It's known as the Kaiser's Battle. It's better known simply as the Spring Offensive of 1918, Germany's Spring Offensive of 1918, but it's also simply known as the Kaiser's Battle in Germany. It was an attempt to break through, penetrate the Allied trenches here, sort of northeast of Paris, drive the Allied soldiers backward, and capture the city of Paris. Now, being able to concentrate everything they had on fighting on the Western Front, the Germans, for the first time in the war, had the kind of numerical advantage that they were supposed to have at the beginning of the war, the way that von Schlieffen had designed it. The Germans had about a 10% numerical advantage over the Allied troops, and it showed. When the Germans began their offensive in the spring of 1918, they drove the Allied forces out of their trenches, out of their secondary trenches, and in some cases, even out of their reserve trenches. The Allied soldiers, the British, the French, the Belgians, were simply cracking under the weight of superior German numbers. And of course, the fact of being exhausted from 4 years of fighting. But the Germans were exhausted from 4 years of fighting too. It was the weight of superior numbers that allowed the Germans now to finally break the stalemate on the Western Front and begin driving the Allied soldiers backward and backward and backward toward the city of Paris. And as a matter of fact, about 2 months into this offensive, by June of 1918, German forces were now closing in on the city. They had reached their deepest penetration into France since the beginning of the war, and German soldiers were actually now fighting just 40 miles away from Paris. In Paris, the sound of the artillery fire, the big cannons booming on the front, could now be heard on the streets of Paris, and people in the city began to panic. How long would it be before the Allied armies would collapse and the Germans would capture the city? Um, and so it looked like it was, in fact, it didn't just look like, it was a very dangerous time for the Allies. The Allied powers in May of 1918, going into June of 1918, were in fact on the brink of losing. And the Germans, despite having fought the war on three fronts, Eastern, Southern, and Western, were now on the brink of victory. They had strong momentum and were driving the Allied forces backward toward Paris, and they were, in fact, 40 miles outside Paris when the first American soldiers began to arrive. Which brings us around to section number 11, the defeat of Germany and the Central Powers. After section 11, I hope that you'll be able to explain why the entry of the United States proved to be one of the main reasons why Germany lost the war. You're going to learn about the American Expeditionary Force, commanded by General John J. Pershing. You'll hear about the Battle of Belleau Wood, the Marne Offensive, and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. All three of these are battles, or sets of battles, that helped bring the war to an end, with a victory for the Allied powers over Germany and the Central Powers. So I'm dropping you now down to the bottom of page 17. So I mentioned that the first Americans began to arrive. It wasn't a lot. The first Americans to fight in France fought in June of 1918 at the Battle of Belleau Wood. So Belleau Wood is a small forested area, again, about 40 miles northeast of Paris. And the first Americans to arrive were 200,000 U.S. Marines. They were of what's called the 1st Marine Division. Now, if you're not familiar, the Marines are basically the best troops the United States has. They're typically, when you have to go into a place where there's hostile forces, the Marines are kind of the leaders of that. They're the first ones to go in. They do the initial fighting. They win the initial ground, and they create a space where your regular soldiers can then come in. That's a lot of times the case. Not always the case, but a lot of times the case. So the 200,000 U.S. Marines who arrived in France in June of 1918 were dumped immediately into the front lines to try to stop the advance of the Germans toward Paris. The British and French hoped that the Americans would be good fighting soldiers, but they feared that they would not be, because the American soldiers, for the most part, had no experience fighting in battles. They had no battlefield experience. Of course, and many of the officers did not either. Some of the U.S. Army officers and Marine officers who led the American troops had fought in the Spanish-American War back in 1898, but that was a very short war, and it was 16 years in the past. And so the reality is that most of the soldiers, most of the officers commanding the American troops had no battlefield experience. The British and French hoped that that wouldn't matter. The British and French hoped that the Americans would make good soldiers, but they feared that their lack of experience would be a problem. For the Germans, it was sort of the other way around. The Germans feared that the Americans would be good soldiers. They hoped that their experience or lack of experience would mean that they weren't. But maybe the most important thing about the American soldiers who were arriving now in France was not experience on the battlefield, but rather that they weren't exhausted. All of the other soldiers on the Western Front, be they Belgian, British, French, or German, were utterly exhausted after 4 years of fighting this brutal trench war. I mean, we talked about how just living in the trenches was a physically, mentally, psychologically, and emotionally exhausting experience. And these British, French, and Belgian on one side, and German on the other side, soldiers, had lived through that exhausting experience for 4 years. They were wiped out. The Americans weren't. They were fresh. They were fresh. And if they weren't experienced, perhaps the fact that they weren't exhausted made up for the difference. Because at the Battle of Belleau Wood, when those 200,000 Marines were dumped into the front to fight the Germans, they performed very well. And they brought the Germans to a stop. The German advance had been moving toward Paris seemingly unrelentingly. They were driving the Allied forces backward and backward and backward and backward. And then at Belleau Wood, they encountered the U.S. soldiers, and the German advance stopped at Belleau Wood. And that was as close as the Germans ever got to winning the war. That was as close as the Germans ever got to Paris. And it goes to show you what an important role the Americans played, not because they were experienced on the battlefield, but because they were not exhausted the way everybody else was. It was extremely demoralizing for the Germans. And what was additionally demoralizing for the Germans then was that over the next month and a half, the next 6 weeks, through the rest of June and July and into August, another million American soldiers were arriving. So if you remember, the German High Command, the commanders of the German Army and Navy, had told their government, they said, we can win the war. If we're allowed to use unrestricted submarine warfare, we can win the war before the Americans arrive in sufficient numbers to make a difference. That was the sort of gamble and risk that the Germans were taking by going back on and resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, knowing that would bring the U.S. into the war. We can win the war before the Americans can arrive in sufficient numbers to make a difference. It turns out that's what they were wrong about. They were right that it took the Americans over a year to recruit and train and deploy their army. It took about 14 months, 15 months. But what Germany was unable to do was win the war in that 14, 15-month period. Because now a million additional American soldiers were arriving. This was the American Expeditionary Force under the command of General John J. Pershing. This was something new in American history. There had never been a large number of American soldiers assembled to cross an ocean to fight a war. There had been wars fought on the North American continent against the British, against the Mexicans in 1846 through 48. There had been, the Spanish-American War, in which small numbers of American soldiers were deployed to fight in Cuba and the Philippines. But this was the first time that a large number of Americans, 1 million+ men, had been deployed across the seas to fight a war. So they were called the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force. Their commander, John J. Pershing. And immediately, Pershing led the American troops into battle in France alongside the other Allied armies. In August and September, the Allied armies, now including the Americans, went on the offensive against the Germans, that is, on the attack. In spring, the Germans had been on the offensive. They had been on the attack, driving the Allied forces backward. Now that advance had been stopped at Belleau Wood, and it was the Allies' turn to attack the Germans and try to drive them backward. And over a period of about 6 weeks, through August and the first half of September of 1918, the Allied forces pushed the Germans back. So this dark blue line represents basically where the trenches had been really during that 3.5 years of stalemate on the Western Front. This darkened area shows where the Germans had pushed during the spring 1918 offensive, also called the Kaiser's Battle. It was the job of the Allied armies now, in what was called the Marne offensive, to push the Germans back to where they had come from. So the Marne offensive is named after two rivers, the Aisne River and the Marne River, which were two rivers where the offensive was taking place. And over a period of 6 weeks, this is what the Allies accomplished. They did, in fact, drive the Germans back to the original lines of trenches from which their offensive had begun in the spring. And that was quite a demoralizing experience for the Germans because when the Germans had begun their spring 1918 offensive, they had a numerical advantage over the Allies, and they had such great momentum, and they were driving the Allies back and back. Now, in August, just 5 months later, they found themselves being driven back to the point where they had started. And at this point, some of the German generals began to suggest to Kaiser Wilhelm II, the ruler of Germany, that what Germany ought to do right now is seek to end the war, with the hope that the Allies would agree to let Germany keep the things that they had gained up till this point, Belgium and all of that territory that they had gained from Russia when Russia had signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But Kaiser Wilhelm II was determined to continue the war. He was a very prideful person who was not about to admit defeat. And so, in late September of 1918, the Allies planned a second offensive, which was called the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. Now, this one is named after a river and a forest, the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. So this is up here, okay? And the idea here now was to penetrate the German trenches and break them and drive the German armies backward out of France and back through Belgium and ultimately into Germany. The idea was that if you penetrated the German trenches, you could capture some of the railroads that the Germans were using to supply their army. And if you did that, the Germans would have to retreat backward toward Germany so that they could continue to supply their army. They would be cut off from their ability to do so if they remained in France, if you captured these railroads here. So the Meuse-Argonne offensive was meant to be the crowning offensive of the war, the one that would force the Germans to give up their positions in France and retreat backward through Belgium and perhaps all the way into Germany. The most difficult job would be to push the Germans out of what was called the Argonne Forest, which is this heavily forested area that you see here, very thick in growth with trees. The Germans had occupied the Argonne Forest pretty much since the beginning of the war. They had really the entire war to fortify it and dig trenches and build defenses. Because the forest was so thick, the soldiers who would be advancing through the forest would not be able to rely on tanks to provide them cover. The tanks would not be able to penetrate the forest. They would not be able to rely on support from aircraft either, because the canopy of the forest would make it impossible to see who you were shooting at. So the soldiers who would be driving the Germans out of the Argonne Forest would be doing it without any kind of support from tanks or planes. They'd have to do it sort of old school, trench by trench and yard by yard and foot by foot. It would have to be a slow, painful, methodical process. The Germans, meanwhile, of course, having built these elaborate defenses, would also fight like tigers, knowing that this was the end for them if they didn't hold this position, their strongest defensive position on the Western Front. And so the job of driving the German troops out of the Argonne Forest was given to the Americans because they had the most energy. They were the least exhausted. They had the most energy, and they had demonstrated themselves to be capable soldiers. So, starting in late September, early October of 1918, the Americans, while the British, French, and Belgians fought in other sectors on the Western Front, attacking the Germans also, the Americans began the slow, arduous process of driving the Germans backward out of their strong positions in the Argonne Forest. The Germans did fight like tigers. They used an enormous amount of poison gas against the Americans. As a matter of fact, 1 out of every 3 American casualties suffered during the war uh, were inflicted in the Argonne Forest. And 1 out of 3 of those casualties suffered in the Argonne Forest were casualties that were poison gas casualties. So it was a physically exhausting and um, costly American effort that did, however, succeed. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was a success. The Germans were driven out of their strong defensive positions in the Argonne Forest. The Americans captured the major railways that were being used to supply the German army, and the Germans were forced to retreat now backward from their strong trenches where they had held, from the position that they had held for over 3.5 years since the beginning of the war. This information convinced the German generals now that the war had to end, that there was no reason to continue the war at all. That to continue the war would simply result in the deaths of more German soldiers and more German civilians who were dying, remember, of starvation and malnutrition because of the British blockade and other factors. And so the German generals now insisted that the Kaiser look for a way to end the war. And the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, as prideful as ever, still refused. And at that point, then, in early November of 1918, the German generals kicked the Kaiser out. They removed Kaiser Wilhelm from power, and he fled to the Netherlands, and he lived the rest of his life in the Netherlands. At that point, the German government, free of the Kaiser, they gave authorization to their generals to negotiate a ceasefire, or what's called an armistice, with the Allied commanders. An armistice or ceasefire is not permanent peace. What it is a promise between the two armies that are fighting each other to stop shooting at each other for a time. An armistice or a ceasefire. It's known in World War I as an armistice. Sometimes you'll hear it called a ceasefire. It is a promise by the two sides, the two armies, to stop shooting each other for a time in hope that the governments can get together and negotiate a permanent peace treaty. Sometimes that fails, and there is no permanent peace treaty signed, and the ceasefire or armistice ends, and the two sides start fighting again. In the case of World War I, that's not what happened. In the case of World War I, the armistice that was negotiated did, in fact, bring a permanent end to the war. There was a peace treaty that was signed following the armistice. So World War I, for all practical purposes, came to an end at 11:11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. There was sporadic fighting right up until the moment when the armistice was scheduled to begin. But you can see the things here: overthrow. This is a reference to the overthrow of Kaiser Wilhelm II. The people are in control. Troops go over to the new authority. Okay, so this is what was going on in Germany: the overthrow of Kaiser Wilhelm II. And then the bigger story for the rest of the world: the World War at an end. Historic document signed at 5 o'clock this morning. Hostilities ended at 11 a.m. today. So as I said, the armistice was not officially the end of the war, but practically speaking in this case, it was. After over 4 years of fighting and devastating losses on both sides, World War I was coming to an end. Now, in our next couple lessons, we'll talk about the negotiation of the peace treaty that brought a permanent end and an official end to the war. And we'll try to show you how the peace treaty that was negotiated helped to set the stage for the Second World War. But that is a topic for our next lesson. So until then, I hope you're able to stay safe and I hope you're able to stay healthy. Take care of yourselves, and I look forward to teaching you again. So long, modern world history students.